Hi everyone, John Heath here again for MiltonRose Learning with another Let's Learn video on Streetcar Name Desire context. Okay, so you can almost feel the sultry heat of New Orleans with this one. So we're going to have a look at some of the key contextual factors underpinning the Tennessee Williams kind of construction of the play. Then we will look at how that kind of context comes into the text itself. So we'll kind of link the two up. And then we'll finish with three really good contextual quotes, which you can then pepper into your essays. So hopefully this should be a really, really useful lesson for you. Okay then, so first off, let's have a look at the context. Okay, so there we go. Okay. So first off then, 1940s America and the key features. So this was a time of post-war social tensions. So World War II has just finished, and the play very much reflects the shift in American society as the traditional southern aristocracy in the southern states of America started to decline and started to kind of take a back seat economically and socially. And working class life gained prominence. So there was a massive change because we had, kind of hundreds of thousands, millions of American soldiers coming back, and the world was changing. So the southern aristocracy and old money and things like that had to kind of give way before the kind of new middle class and working class that were starting to gain prominence. So it's a very unsettled time in that sense. Then also, on the back of that, gender roles and patriarchy. Now, we've come up against patriarchy in many of our videos. So patriarchy just means male-dominated society, and it was starting to change. So, however, at this specific point, women still had kind of limited power. Patriarchy was still very much in place, and they were often defined by their relationships with men. And I think that's a really kind of key point when we're looking at any female character really in the play. So Blanche's downfall, for instance, and Stella's dependency on Stanley, the appalling character of Stanley, reveal the era's harsh expectations of women. You know, they were kind of shackled to men in some ways, and so the patriarchy was starting to break down, but it hadn't broken down yet. And so women were still very much kept in a kind of limited role socially. Okay, then we have a little bit more on the context. So let's just tease a few more points, or a couple more points out at least. So the Old South versus New America. So America has always been quite a divided nation in some ways. And there was a bit of a geographical divide between the North and the South. And the southern states of America were much more traditional, much more kind of Republican voting normally, and kind of, very kind of old school in their views. So the play captures the cultural clash between fading southern states and their what we call gentility and their kind of obsession with manners, which is typified by Blanche, and the rising urban working class power, which was starting to come to the fore, epitomised through characters like Stanley. So there's a real kind of social battle going on in the play, almost for the soul of America, going on between the two kind of rivals, almost North versus South, and kind of southern gentility versus kind of working class kind of dynamism, if I can put it that way. So I think that's quite a broad social issue that was happening at the time. And then another one is we're at the period now of kind of just at the start of kind of what I suppose we could call mental health awareness. So Blanche's mental breakdown reflects the era's poor understanding of mental trauma and psychological illness, especially in women. But the fact that it was kind of being discussed in high literature like this is still nevertheless a hopeful thing, because it was actually just starting to be explored. So even if we can't understand it fully in this period, because obviously, it's a very complex topic, but at least it was being discussed, and that mental health awareness was just starting in this period. Okay. Now, how does that feed in to Tennessee Williams? I like that picture. He's looking very jolly there. So what does Tennessee Williams think about this context then? Because that's really important to get the high grades to unlock the upper bands of the mark scheme for you all. So when I'm teaching my classes, I kind of highlight two main points here. I think first off, Tennessee Williams is giving quite a damning critique of masculine power. It's what we would call in modern day kind of parlance, we'd call it toxic masculinity. And I think Tennessee Williams absolutely loathes that. So Williams is exposing the brutality of the patriarchal system in America through Stanley's dominance, challenging the concept or the idea of male entitlement and control. He's saying it's wrong, basically, and that it needs to be subverted, critiqued, and ultimately destroyed. We need to push towards gender equality. I think that's a real part of this play. Also, I think Williams has a big sympathy for the vulnerable. So Williams gives a voice to society's kind of outsiders, people we don't normally hear from in literature. So women, which has changed obviously now in the modern era, but it was less so in Tennessee Williams's time. The mentally ill, the sexually repressed, real kind of fringe characters in society almost. And he's quite interested in giving them a voice, which is quite wonderful in its way. And he's highlighting their fragility in a harsh, judgmental world. He's saying that it's not always their fault that they're mentally ill or repressed, or, you know, all these kinds of things that, you know, are kind of products of their environment, basically. And it's not always their fault. And I think Williams does stand up for the vulnerable. And you can see that in a lot of the characters, because most of the characters in this play are very vulnerable in some ways. Okay. Now, let's hop along over to the context in action. How does this play out? Well, the first one's going to be the American dream and wealth. And you can see from that image there, of that kind of stylized image of the American dream being success and kind of wealth and power. And you can see that's kind of almost a typification of the American dream. But how does that play out in this play then? Well, let's have a look. So, first off then, I would say there's a massive clash between characters like Blanche and Stanley, who reflect post-war, reflecting post-war tensions in 1940s New Orleans, where the play is set, obviously, where economic struggle and class mobility, so everybody wants to move their way up in the into the upper class, for instance, but it made the American dream feel very distant and unstable. The American dream, the idea that anybody can make it and anybody can be a success through hard work, is all well and good, but it doesn't pan out that way for many people, and it doesn't pan out for pretty much anyone in this play. So I do think there's a kind of real critique of the American dream happening here, and that shows in the lack of success in pretty much every character in this play. Then we have gender and power dynamics, something we've touched on so far in this lesson. So women's roles were limited in this era, as we know. So Blanche's fall and Stella's dependence towards Stanley highlight how patriarchy restricted female autonomy and what we would call agency, their freedom. Agency is a great word to explore in your essays. And it made their survival dependent on men. So the power dynamics were almost, kind of locked in, frozen in time almost, and they were ripe for change. And obviously about 15, 20 years after this, when we hit the 60s, it did start to change, obviously, but not quite yet, not at this point in history. And I think Williams is impatient with that change, and he wants to push forward gender equality and get rid of these patriarchal power dynamics. And the last one, for context in action, is family and mental health. So the play reflects 1940s stigmas around mental illness and emotional trauma. There was a massive stigma. If you were seen as being kind of mentally ill, then, there's something wrong with you. You're weird, you're strange. And in some ways you could argue there's even still a bit of a stigma in today's era. But in the 1940s, it was a big, big no-no. It was almost a social taboo. So Blanche's breakdown, her psychological kind of nervous disposition, reveals how unresolved grief, societal pressures, and the lack of support can ultimately destroy a person. And she kind of does get destroyed in the play. So I think clearly Williams is trying to unpick and destigmatise mental illness in this play, and it's lovely in that sense because he's trying to give a voice to the voiceless and actually give mentally ill characters a fair hearing in his literature, and I think that's one of the most powerful parts of this play. So moving forward, let's have a look at 3 of the best quotes in terms of their context. Okay. So first off, we have, here he is, Stanley Kowalski. He looks very serious there, doesn't he? Okay, so his quote on masculine power. "Every man is a king, and I am the king around here, so don't forget it." Okay, it's almost, almost kind of whimsical in its macho kind of approach to life. Now it seems very kind of almost old-fashioned. But nevertheless, that reflects post-war patriarchal attitudes. There was a lot of men in society at that time who thought like that, where male dominance and authority were asserted aggressively. If you need to physically assert, almost like the law of the jungle, then that's what you do. And it's, again, quite concerning in that sense. So Stanley represents working class masculinity, or what we would call toxic masculinity now maybe, asserting control in a world where traditional gender roles were shifting. Women were just starting to get a little bit more equality and a little bit more power, and Stanley doesn't like it. Hence the term king, which is a very almost old-fashioned and out-of-place word to use in what was a democratic republic of America. So that quote's really good if you're going to analyse Stanley, or if you are obviously analysing it from a feminist perspective. Okay, then we have the tragic figure of Blanche. Okay, so here then, illusion versus reality. So Blanche very famously says, "I don't want realism, I want magic." Okay, don't we all? So let's unpick that quote. So Blanche's yearning for fantasy reflects the struggle to cope with mental trauma and social change in post-war America. She was a Southern belle at the top of Southern society, and it's all changing. It's like the rug has been pulled from under her. So her escape into illusion highlights the emotional toll of a society that offered women little protection or purpose outside of being beautiful or being married. So she almost is struggling for her identity. I think that's the key concept to explore with Blanche. Her identity is shifting as the society shifts around her, and she can't deal with it. Okay, and she doesn't have the mental skill set to be able to cope with the social change. And I think that's a very powerful quote, and something which could affect us all, sometime in our life when our identity has to shift. It's a big social change and she's not mentally equipped for it. I think it's a real tragic quote in that sense. And then finally, okay, to return to Blanche, one of the most famous lines in the whole play, if not the best line, I would say. Blanche says, "I have always depended on the kindness of strangers." So this iconic final line reflects Blanche's tragic vulnerability and the lack of meaningful support for women facing mental health issues or isolation in the 40s. It underscores the play's very, very bleak, pessimistic view of how American society treats those who can't conform. If you don't play the game and follow all the social norms and live up to patriarchy and basically don't question them in any way, then you'll be ostracized, you'll be stigmatized, and ultimately it will end in your mental kind of collapse. Very brutal in that sense. And I think that quote really symbolizes the heartbeat of this play, which is that American society in the 40s is too brutal and it needs to move with the times in terms of gender equality, but also in terms of support for the mentally ill, and to give them more kind of pastoral support in terms of trauma and things like that. So a very profound quote to kind of leave it with. Now then, let's just have a quick overview. So we've teased out some of the key contextual factors regarding the American dream, the Old South versus New America, very important, as well as some of Tennessee Williams's kind of personal views, I think, on those issues. Looked at some of the context in action, such as gender and power dynamics, which were very much patriarchal, but were starting to change. And then we've just left you with 3 really good quotes, which are always good for you to reflect on and to maybe linguistically analyse, ready to drop into your exams and your essays. Okay, so it just remains to say, if you wouldn't mind helping us out, it's always appreciated. So don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and tap the bell icon if you found this lesson useful. And please, we'll be dropping more lessons every week on this play, but also other texts as well. So stay tuned for those. And it just remains to say, obviously, thanks for listening and take care.